So I'll talk over it. So good morning. Welcome everyone to SAS 5P04. This is a transdisciplinary sustainability seminar series at Brock University. My name is Marilyne Jollineau. I'm an associate professor in the Environmental Sustainability Research Center, or ESRC, at Brock. And I wear a couple of hats in that I'm the presenter today. I'm the instructor of this course, and I'm also the graduate program director for our Master of Sustainability program. So I'm wearing a couple hats today. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for joining us. I'm talking today about the use of geospatial technologies in addressing contemporary challenges, or even think of them as opportunities in environmental sustainability. So the format today is basically 35 to 40-minute presentation. We've got guests coming to the class today from outside of the university, from within the university, and then of course we have Master of Sustainability students that are part of this course that are in the class. So for all audience members, I think it's helpful to know that many of us are coming from different backgrounds and disciplines, from biology and ecology to geography and environmental studies to sociology and anthropology. So we have all kinds of different people with all kinds of different backgrounds, which means that a talk like this has to be tailored somewhat to a wide range of people. So I'll do my best to not use any jargon on you today or any acronyms, which we can be bad for at times. And then maybe around 35, 40-minute mark, you'll be asked or invited to ask questions. So wait for that as we get closer to the end of this talk. So first, before I continue, I know that many of you are joining me from all over the globe, right down to sort of more locally, but Brock University acknowledges the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging just reminds us of the great standard of living that we have that is directly related to the resources and the friendship of Indigenous people. I am actually geographically located very close to Brock University, but I'm aware that you'll be thinking about the land that you're on specifically today. So to set a bit of the context for this talk, it's been in the last couple of years, I've heard a lot of people talking about, data analyses, really understanding data, extracting information from data, and student awareness of data analyses, and in particular, their understanding as well of spatial data analysis. And I think developing the skill set around not just being aware of geospatial data, which is often referred to as spatial data, I think is really critical, especially when we're thinking about finding solutions to the environmental sustainability challenges that we face. And I think of, some of the ones that come to the top of my mind are climate change, pollution, land degradation, biodiversity loss, water quality and algae blooms, for example, in the Great Lakes, right? These are some of the challenges that we face. Food security as well, right? Thinking about food production and how we grow food and how these challenges really present a great opportunity for us to think about multiple perspectives that we can bring to these challenges. And so I want to note that I see geospatial technologies in a way as one perspective that we can bring to helping to find solutions to the problems that we face. And I note that not all problems require a geospatial perspective, right? They're all going to be quite unique. But I think it's important for sustainability scientists and students of sustainability science to develop and enhance their skill set around geospatial data or location-based data. And these are some geospatial technologies are the tools that we use to collect those data, to analyze those data, to manage them, to visualize the data. I love data visualization. I'm a very visual person. So seeing the data, come alive in an animation really resonates well with me, to even storing those data. So why do I think that these tools, let's say, are appropriate? Well, many of the environmental sustainability challenges we face today occur across space and over time. And so geospatial technologies, fortunately, allow us to look at space and time, right? And how things change, the spatial arrangement of things or objects on the Earth's surface can change with time. They also change with the scale at which we look at a particular challenge, from very local to the global challenges. So those pieces are all important to think about as you sit back and listen to this presentation. Another important note is that these contemporary challenges in environmental sustainability really do require collaboration with others. With others meaning community members, others meaning politicians, right? So people can play multiple roles in a community, as a resident, maybe as an employee of a town or a city. Think about, the perspective that people come to a problem with, like business owners. So we need these sort of multiple perspectives to look at the kind of different ways that we can come to solving problems. Again, geospatial technologies are just one of those perspectives. And I give you an example using this image that I have on the screen as a backdrop, right? Here's a remote sensing image. So it's acquired from above the Earth's surface. We're looking down at the Earth's surface and we see this beautiful vegetated landscape. We see some trees there. We see some agricultural crops delineated by boundaries around them. So we see a lot, in particular, of vegetation here, but we also see a pathway or a road that kind of breaks up the landscape. So we can see this and appreciate the spatial arrangement of objects in this landscape. We can actually even quantify the spatial arrangement by looking at measures of pattern in the landscape, so spatial pattern. And this is a really important piece because pattern tells us something about the kind of connectivity in the landscape, gaps in the landscape, maybe gaps in a tree canopy, for example, as well as fragmentation. So think about habitat and fragmentation of habitat by roads and other corridors that cut through a habitat. So we can measure these patterns at one point in time and as well over time to help us really make informed decisions about these kinds of challenges that we face today. So that was a long introduction. I don't normally stay that long on slide one, but I want to set up that sort of context and tone for the talk because I've spent 30 plus years studying geospatial technologies, and I know that there are many different views on the technology. Technology is interesting in and of itself. Some people really embrace technology or sort of new innovations in technology. Others aren't so keen to embrace the technology, right? And I am well aware that, there are many different perspectives on these kind of tools, right? I argue that the word tool is a little bit tricky, because if it's just a tool, then people think anybody can pick it up and use it. And that's simply not the case. You need to appreciate the problem that you're studying. You need to appreciate also, how these kind of tools, tools will you use, why, how, etc. So today I'm hopeful that people will come to this presentation and maybe kind of see things or hear things differently, right? So the graphic on the top left is a great image for me to talk about seeing things differently, right? Here's again a remote sensing image taken from above a desert landscape, where we very clearly see camels migrating across the landscape, but actually we're looking mostly at their shadows, right? The sun setting, and we see these black figures that are the shadows of those sort of linear white features that are the actual camels, right? I love that again gives us this very, seeing things from above gives us a very different perspective on what's happening on the ground. And so I just ask that you think about also changing your perspective today on how you come into this class and this talk. My purpose is to share with you my over 30 years of experience in studying and trying to understand geospatial technologies and how they can be used to study environmental challenges and opportunities that we face. It's also to acknowledge the benefits of these technologies, but also some challenges. Like all perspectives, they come with some pros and cons, and then to provide some resources to those who might be thinking about learning more about these different kinds of technologies. So my talk is organized around these three main points. I'm going to start with my academic background so that you know sort of where I'm coming from. Back in the 90s, I started a degree, undergraduate degree at Carleton University. This is where I first learned about geospatial technologies in year one in geography. Very interesting note, back then you could get a concentration in what they called geoprocessing. Now it's geospatial technologies, but you could get a concentration, but only if you were a BA honors in geography. And I was kind of inclined to lean toward a BSc, Bachelor of Science. So it's kind of funny that my degree is primarily comprised of undergraduate courses in either geospatial technologies or sciences like climatology, meteorology, soil science. But I did also take several other courses that were in resources management. So that was a pretty interesting sort of undergrad degree, but I think it's still kind of funny that it wasn't really a BA, but more of a BSc. But it gets to the point that, in many cases, we get caught up in these, discipline-specific things, and we forget to kind of think that we need to look at lots of issues that we face from different disciplinary backgrounds, right? So I make that point because I don't think one's better than the other. And in fact, I think we benefit from looking at multiple perspectives to a problem, from the social sciences all the way to the sort of natural sciences. And sustainability science lends itself nicely to thinking that way. So I did my undergrad at Carleton, my hometown of Ottawa, and then I ventured out to the University of Waterloo, where I learned that Phil Howarth, who really was seen at the time as a Canadian expert in remote sensing technologies, and picture of Phil Howarth is on the top left of this graphic here. I learned a lot from Phil, and one of the things that I learned from him was that, in thinking about, through my Master's of Environmental Studies and my PhD in Geography, he reminded me that it's really important, one, to think about multiple perspectives to a problem, And you need to collaborate. You need to collaborate with others to understand, these different perspectives from which people come to look at a problem. I also learned from others at the University of Waterloo, like Bruce Mitchell, Gordon Nelson, and other kind of bigger thinkers in terms of sustainable development. Back then is what we kind of focused the conversation around. And it was really around that time that sustainability science was starting to emerge in the literature, getting into the sort of early 2000s. And then lastly, because I'm keen to learn and technologies change over time, I took Transport Canada's advanced RPAS license so that I could fly remotely piloted aircraft systems in research and use them in teaching as well. So I include some other visuals for you to see that I still think it's important to continue learning, but it also notes that these technologies require us to continue learning. They've been around since the 60s, even though people sometimes think that these are new technologies. The technologies have evolved, but they're not really that new. Okay, so before we can talk about geospatial technologies, I think it's important to talk about, what are geospatial data. So geospatial data, and sometimes people just use the word spatial data. These are data that are associated with a particular location on the Earth's surface. Typically that location is given in degrees or in meters, right? In easting or northing values, or they're given in UTM, Universal Transverse Mercator coordinates that are given in meters. Either way, we have location-based information. This tree here is an example of a specific location where we could, look at the location and map it on the Earth's surface. But then what's really important too is to know that there are non-spatial data that can be attached to spatial data. And we often refer to this information as attribute information. So I show you at the bottom of this graphic, where we normally store those kinds of data are to give the lat long coordinates of the data, the location of the spatial data, and then we give the attribute information. And that is a huge advantage to us. So it's important to note spatial data and non-spatial data are attached to those. So now we know what spatial data are. What are geospatial technologies? You see a definition here and some images of each of these technologies. I include 3, but of course, there's a list, an exhaustive list beyond these 3, or sometimes these 3 are the backdrop to but they're basically a number of different sort of high-tech systems that we use to acquire, analyze, store, and even visualize location-based data. And the one great way to get location-based data specifically is using a global positioning system. So the bottom graphic there on the left shows, a tractor, because in agricultural studies, and you can think about precision agriculture where farmers can actually map out and geolocate crops on their individual plants within their crops, and use this information and attach attributes to those particular points so that they can think about, instead of sort of uniformly treating a field, they can think about targeting their management. So only using water where or applying water to the field where it's actually needed, right? And this is one way that we can be more environmentally sort of sustainable in terms of our agricultural production. So GPS, secondly, is the top right, shows a graphic of geographic information systems, basically these layers of data that can be brought into one sort of system. And then you can analyze those data and extract information from them. And I note that GIS is kind of interesting in that it has, we've thought about community engagement in technology by bringing people into collecting data, crowdsourcing data, or community scientists that we have recording data on phones, and then we can pull that into a GIS environment. So I think people are probably most familiar with GIS. And then lastly, the bottom right graphic is an example of an RPAS system. Some people call these drones being launched, and that's a form of remote sensing. And I would argue that remote sensing is probably the least well understood of all of the technologies, but my favorite, my personal favorite. I think it's really cool technology. And I just want to note that by using some of these technologies, we can actually, not just better understand contemporary challenges that we face in environmental sustainability, but we can also use them to help contribute to more sustainable practices. So think about the use of virtual reality, for example, as a way to keep people from traveling and instead bring them together in an online setting to reduce their carbon footprint. Think about remote sensing being used to view from a distance, an environmental sustainability challenge like habitat fragmentation, and we're not embedded in the landscape. So we're not disturbing that habitat. Just a deeper dive into each of these technologies, and I'll give you examples throughout. But global positioning systems, we use a handheld device that then kind of communicates with satellites orbiting the Earth's surface and gives us very precise and accurate location information. And the graphic kind of gives you an example of that, that sort of notion. Knowing your location, of course, has always been really important, but it then allows us to know a location and revisit that location over time. And in the past, what we've done is, use flagging tape or spray paint to mark these locations, where now we can simply use this handheld device and allow it to help us navigate back to a site and revisit it over time, and then take measurements like soil moisture, for example, and look at how soil moisture has changed in an agricultural, viticultural context over time. What I love about using a GPS is that you can overlay in the bottom right, that graphic with the green dots shows that you can then overlay these onto remote sensing image as a backdrop to give it spatial context. Here, I just want to note that a huge advantage of using these technologies, and I use the example of a vineyard and collecting soil moisture measurements in a vineyard. So on the left, you see basically the tabular data that we can generate, and we can collect various attributes or non-spatial data like soil moisture about these specific point data locations. But we can't really appreciate just even one variable, soil moisture, right, collected at one time. We can't really appreciate what that looks like across the landscape, how it varies across the landscape in tabular form. So geovisualization allows us to actually see the data draped onto the landscape. And in fact, we can put the point data on the landscape. That's the kind of upper left graphic. Upper right, we can then use different kind of mapping tools, right? Look at density mapping, for example, to show those areas with higher soil moisture values versus lower. So that's really, really helpful to kind of help you visualize where there's maybe a lot of moisture versus not so much moisture. And then we can kind of interpolate those point data and produce these surfaces that show areas, right? Soil moisture map, for example, on the bottom of this graphic here, shows you just one vineyard at Stratus Vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and at one particular time. But we can also then measure and soil moisture over time and interpolate that across these surfaces. And now we can actually see patterns in variability of soil moisture over time. This affords us a great opportunity to think about irrigation, variable rate sprayers for pesticide, fertilizer, etc. And again, kind of reduce our impact on the environment by not just uniformly treating the whole landscape as though the conditions are the same at all points. Instead, we treat it very differently. Irrigation of crops is a massive consumer of fresh water, so thinking about water scarcity, this technology plays a huge role, but also thinking about even land degradation, soil degradation, etc. So for conservation of water, to think about soil erosion and the negative impacts of soil erosion, reducing productivity of the landscape, I think is really important. Another piece to this, for those of you who are interested, there are several current articles around these kinds of challenges and how geospatial technologies have been used, and even thinking about kind of adaptive decision support systems like these variable rate sprayers that I've been talking about as one example. So I can provide you with many different kinds of examples. Hopefully this is helpful for you to see how these can be used to help us really understand these challenges that we face. Okay, remote sensing. So you've learned a little bit about remote sensing. Now to tell you a bit more, this is a technology that allows us to look at the Earth from a distance. Sometimes that distance is, very close, a meter away, to from looking at the distance from outer space. And basically this technology obtains information about objects using a device that's not in contact with those objects. So an example here, you see we rely heavily on the sun's energy. The sun's energy travels to the Earth in wave form and interacts with Earth surface features. And then that results in either reflection or emission of energy back to a sensor that records that energy and can tell us a lot about the composition and chemical composition of those Earth surface features. Think about from far in the north of Canada, studying landscapes there and sea ice extent all the way to mid-latitude wetlands, and even, thinking of the coral reef environments off the east coast of Australia. So we actually can use these tools underwater as well, which is really cool. And again, looking at, local to global challenges that we face. So here's just the kind of bit of background to remote sensing. Relies on thinking about energy across the electromagnetic spectrum. Yes, we're diving back into grade 11 physics, which is fantastic. This is not very complicated. It's basically the spectrum gives us a continuum upon which we can locate wavelengths of electromagnetic energy, from really short wavelength to very long wavelength. So think of from one wave crest to another, that's a wavelength. So these graphics that I show you around the spectrum are examples of very short wavelength to very long wavelength energy. And only certain parts of the electromagnetic spectrum are available for us to kind of view the Earth's surface from a distance. So, think about X-ray technology. We don't typically use that for remote sensing to look at our surface features, but the idea is kind of the same, right? That we can look at the health or condition of our mouth, just like we can use these Earth observation tools to look at the kind of health or condition of the Earth's surface. We can typically get sort of one band of data from a part of the spectrum. X-ray is an example where the tones in the image tell us something about what's going on in that image. Or we can combine multiple bands and look at different color composite imagery. So the bottom 3 slides on the left here show you that composite imagery, where what's really important to note is if the land doesn't quite look like you expect it to, it's because we've shifted the colors that we can see, our own visual system operates within, to see other energy, other electromagnetic energy not available to our own eye, which is, I think, really cool. So for example, thinking about forest fires, massive challenge that we face, from the thermal infrared part of the spectrum here, then we can actually see through the cloud and smoke to active fire and non-active fire. So for management purposes, we can then at least think about how we manage that fire and think more broadly about how we're managing that forest canopy, right? To potentially reduce the chances of fire. All the way to the other side, the longer wavelength part of the spectrum, the microwave part of the spectrum here with radar data, we can see very different things or features of the Earth's surface from these different parts of the spectrum. What's really cool is, of course, we can get tabular data as well. So here on the right, I'm just showing you an example of a spectral reflectance curve, but I'm hopeful that you'll see that our visual system only operates in the visible part of the spectrum, but remote sensing allows us to see across these other parts in the near infrared, the thermal infrared, to see and access all kinds of other information about, in this case, vegetation. So we can actually understand from the technology that, hey, you know, the vegetation is experiencing some kind of stress related to maybe water deficiency, nutrient deficiency. And again, we're getting ahead of some of these challenges right around. So we know ahead of time that, okay, we maybe need to target our management. So let's say irrigation of the crop to specific locations rather than uniformly across the entire landscape. Similarly, we can also look at species differentiation, look at invasive species versus non-invasive species. We can think about disease within a plant and know as an early warning system that a plant is suffering from a particular disease. And then we can better manage that. Okay, so just moving on there, don't want to spend too much time on that, but what I think is really important to note when we're thinking about spatial data analyses is thinking about, remote sensing gives us really great images of the Earth's surface in parts of the spectrum that our eyes aren't operating within, so that, allows us to access great information, but we need to be able to kind of extract that information to then use it in thinking about the decisions or solutions that we can come to. So the purpose of remote sensing spatial data analyses is to extract information from remote sensing data. There's all kinds of examples of how we can do that. The image on the right shows you an example of just a vegetation index. And these indices can actually tell us something about the condition of the vegetation. So in a wetland environment, for example, this can be really useful. Also think about an agricultural context. This is very handy information to have. One of my passions is to think about looking at mapping the landscape using remotely sensed data. So wetland mapping, for example, again, just recently I was asked about, how do we manage Phragmites? Phragmites is an invasive species that many Great Lakes wetlands experience. They kind of dominate the landscape and change habitat for other plants and animals, and really create a lot of problems. So often we want to map where are those sort of plants, and then what are some of the ways we can manage them, right? And then we can even think about, has that management, what are the outcomes, and has that been effective, right? So we can test, burning those plants, cutting them out of the landscape, even chemical treatment of Phragmites is sometimes used. But what's nice about the technology is at least it can then allow us to figure out, okay, is that actually working or not working? Okay, and lastly, geographic information systems. And I'm kind of explaining the different ways that we can use these tools along the way. But geographic information systems, computer-based system that allows us to then record, interpret, analyze all of these data. And typically most people are familiar with the GIS because GPS, remote sensing data, all of those data typically get funneled into a GIS environment. So one example, using some research that I've been working on over the past couple of years, is the urban tree canopy. And there's a reading that the students did. There's a talk on our SRC YouTube channel just dealing with the urban tree canopy. So I'm not going to take too deep a dive, except to say that, of course, given the urban population is increasing globally and even here locally, take the town of Lincoln as an example, where we really want to think about the urban tree canopy. There's massive benefits to maintaining a healthy urban tree canopy. I'll get to those in a moment. And geospatial technologies, specifically remote sensing and GIS, can help us to really understand that canopy and even assess that canopy. So why? Getting at a bit of the why, and on the right is the graphic showing you the many different benefits of the urban tree canopy. And I note that it goes from all the way from the level of the tree to the street and city and beyond, right? And you hopefully remember from the McGee 2012 reading that in that paper they talked about how the urban tree canopy really provides important ecological, environmental, economic, and social benefits. And I just flagged for us that in the context of COVID, we're realizing really the benefits of the urban tree canopy and for people to get out and be out in natural landscapes, right, is really, really healthy for many different reasons. So the urban tree canopy, one of the kind of challenges is how do you manage it without some kind of baseline data set? And it can be really difficult to get ground-based measurements. The town of Lincoln, for example, struggles because a lot of the canopy is on private land. So you can't just run with your GPS unit and start mapping out the canopy. But geospatial technologies allow us to do that. So for example, we can look at the canopy from space. And one of our students is currently working on a thesis around this, to look at the canopy and to also assess the canopy. Where are the gaps in the canopy? Where might we plant? Where are the suitable locations for planting, tree planting? And also, thinking about then monitoring those plants or trees over time. So something that that's been a great experience for us in looking at St. Catharines and the town of Lincoln is to use Trio Code Niagara. That's a geospatial. Niagara is a not-for-profit in the region, and this is a community kind of engagement project that we've been involved in, where we've been literally mapping the trees and then giving some sense of the economic benefit. So actually attaching a dollar value to those sort of services that the tree canopy provides. And you'll know from the reading that this information that's generated can be very helpful to decision makers, right? To kind of craft policy, to think about canopy targets is a big conversation in the literature right now, and management strategies, and to support proper management of the urban tree canopy. So this just gives you an example of the kinds of dollar values placed on these trees based on existing literature. There's the St. Catherine's database as well. So you can go to that website, the Trio Code Niagara, and look at the different municipalities in the region. These aren't completed inventories yet of the urban tree canopy, but it's a start. So these point locations have been collected by community scientists. So, anyone can go out and actually map these and put them into that database along with the attribute information. So the type of tree, etc. And so we've been undertaking this in the town of Lincoln. And I just want to note here that this information is really helpful, as I mentioned, to see gaps in the canopy as one example. And one way of being able to really see those gaps is to think about spatial pattern and spatial data analysis. And if I said to you now, is that pattern, clustered, random, dispersed, it would be, I think, really hard for you to kind of tell me. So I just want to note a little bit about spatial pattern and analyzing spatial data and spatial patterns. So I'm going to kind of spend the last bit of the presentation here talking specifically about how do we look at spatial data analyses in terms of spatial pattern, and then to give you an example of that. So first, I just want to look at, and I produced this horrible graphic. Some of these graphics don't have sources because I created them. And there's a bit too many sort of grids in this, but basically what I'm trying to show you is what point patterns look like in the top of this graphic. You can have either random, dispersed, or clustered points. So think of dispersed patterns being the furthest away all of these points can be from each other. Clustered being there's kind of groupings, and then random is of course random. And we can also look at these patterns in terms of area patterns, and even think about continuous data and look at the pattern of continuous data being either described statistically now using spatial data analysis and spatial statistics to actually determine whether a pattern is random, dispersed, or clustered. Okay, so we're often interested in the spatial arrangement of objects and their attributes. So think of trees and tree species. You can think of disease in the landscape, just like it's useful to maybe know the location, for example, of coronavirus cases, as just one example, right? Where to know if there's clustering of cases, then that might help allow better sort of manage that. If there's dispersion, then we know that's a little bit more challenging. So we're interested in the arrangement of objects, and you can see from the two graphics on the top right, we can go from a gradient of, not very much change across space to the checkerboard pattern of massive change across space. And it's important to think about this because GIS and remote sensing data, when you look at those data in the software designed to analyze those data, then often those are organized in this kind of format, this sort of checkerboard or this grid format. Grid is the term used in GIS, and pixel is the term used in remote sensing. But you can think of like a TV screen or a computer screen made up of these little squares. So either there's dramatic change over space or there's not much change across space. So we can analyze these patterns using both descriptive and inferential statistics. Again, spatial stats are not new. These statistics were used in the 1800s. Some of you may be familiar with the example of John Snow map of cholera deaths in England, where the Broad Street pump, I don't know if you can see it clearly on this graphic, but there were a cluster of cases and deaths around that pump, and they determined that the outbreak was connected to that specific pump, right? Okay, so to use an example in a context of environmental sustainability, first we want to talk a little bit about measures of spatial arrangement, or we can think of even as spatial association, right? So far I've talked only about, thinking about GIS and one location, but what's really convenient is using spatial data analyses and spatial stats. Then we can actually think about what's happening around locations. So, I'm here at this location. Let's say a tree is planted at this location and is diseased. What about the trees around it? Are they also diseased or non-diseased? So Moran's eye is one example of a measure of spatial autocorrelation. And you can think of correlation. This is the spatial equivalent of correlation, where we can essentially look at a landscape and say whether a variable is clustered or dispersed across that landscape. So using an example that I know and love, I've studied a lot of inland and shoreline wetlands in the Great Lakes, and many of you will probably know that, that wetlands are important ecosystems in the landscape. We are home to many of the global wetland resource base here in Canada and in the Great Lakes region. Of course, we want to try to protect the ecosystem services that are provided by these landscapes. And really, to do that, we need to know, well, where are they, and what plants are there, etc. So, using remote sensing technology, and I wrote a paper back several years ago now with another colleague and my supervisor of my PhD, where we actually looked at taking those remote sensing data and converting them or transforming them using what we call image classification to then group similar pixels into classes of upland environments, but also of wetland environments. So in Canada, we divide wetlands into marsh, swamp, bog, fen, etc. So some of those appear here. Just an interesting note, there's been some progress on this work, and I just reviewed a manuscript the other day where some of this work was cited, which is always fun to see. So the science is still kind of moving forward. But what I note here is you see specific locations and you see what the class is at that location, whether it's a marsh, whether it's shallow open water, but we don't really talk about what's happening, in that landscape. Whereas if we make use of spatial statistics, now we can actually look at biodiversity, right, and measuring biodiversity. So in this study, we took it one step further and said, let's not just make use of the spatial information, or the spectral information, individual pixels. Let's also look at neighboring pixels, what's happening in this area. So instead of thinking about, a specific location and counting up species, so look at species richness as a measure of biodiversity, now we could actually map out that diversity, right? And it's shown on this map here as heterogeneity versus homogeneity, right? And in a wetland context, we really want a biodiverse landscape, right? We don't want homogeneity. So this was, I think, a really fun exercise in thinking about that. So now again, it gives yet another piece of information that wetland managers can use to inform their decision making around, biodiversity, habitat, etc., in the landscape or in a wetland environment. Okay, there are many, as you probably imagine, there are many applications of geospatial technologies that are used to help us understand and study challenges and opportunities we face in environmental sustainability. I was in on a talk just the other day. I wanted to learn a bit more about some of the work my colleagues have been doing. So, thinking about marine environments, and I tuned into a talk on looking at fish populations and the challenges of mapping out fish populations using geospatial technologies. But these technologies are used in many different environments so that we can study, the impact of climate change or shoreline change. We've had a student in our program look at shoreline change in the town of Lincoln as an example. Meredith DeCock looked at that work with Liette Vasseur. But we can look at all kinds of different environments, and I have many different articles that, if you're interested, that I can share with you around these topics. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that we want to keep an open mind about thinking about technologies and technological innovations. And with 30 plus years of experience, I'm aware that there are many, many benefits and also many challenges. And I list only a few. The benefits of these technologies being on the left, the challenges being on the right. On the benefit side, I mean, having an ability to get precise and accurate baseline information from which we can then track and monitor progress toward, our management goals is so helpful. A digital database that we can combine with other data sets is also massive value to us. These technologies allow us to either visit locations in virtual space that we'd never have access to. Dave Fennell talked about us, even tourism, right? Virtual tourism and looking at places we've never been, or visiting the Grand Canyon, right, from a distance. But also it allows us to look at areas that are otherwise inaccessible to us, right? So because they perhaps are inaccessible because we can't get to them physically, maybe that changes over time, or it's just a difficult environment to be in. So that's really helpful, but also to look at a much larger geographic area is really helpful too. However, I'm well aware that many people can also argue, hey, these require a lot of expertise. They require the massive cost investment in hardware and software. Think about accuracy, reliability, validity issues, accessibility. Now I'm thinking around who has access to free data, who has access to the information extracted from the data, right? These are challenges that we need to face. They're kind of the realities of looking at things from a different perspective. The one benefit, I think, is that we can share our expertise and better understand the challenges that we face. Costs can be kind of reduced, at least when now we think about having open data, public participation in data collection. Yes, people can make mistakes in recording information that they've collected. That's a reality that we need to face, right? But we can also get really great information from others. Residents in the community, in the town of Lincoln, for example, mapping trees on their private lands using a handheld GPS, using their phones to record birds that they sighted in a particular area. In terms of software, there are freely open source software types that are available now. So we are trying to address some of these challenges that we face, but they do still kind of continue, right? Think about how we publish, right? And we publish predominantly in English, so that alone is a massive challenge in terms of communication. Okay, so I shared with you my knowledge and expertise. My goal was to also acknowledge these benefits and challenges, and then lastly, to provide you with just some examples, and I'm happy to share these slides with anyone who's interested in exploring some of these examples. There's many Canadian sites that I think would be really interesting to you. I just know Canada's spatial data infrastructure, where there are policies around, privacy and the use of geospatial technologies, and how we share these data. Tri-council funding projects now, we have to be thinking about how we'll share our data and how we label data, etc. So these are ways that we have made progress. Open source GIS and remote sensing software, so QGIS, for example, is freely available. RStudio, where you can perform remote sensing data analyses, but also these kind of statistical analyses like spatial stats as well. So many other resources for you. A little plug for my course in this coming fall, Landscape Ecology and Ecosystem Management. I promise you that it will be interesting and engaging because I love this topic. But I'm happy to also hear about what you're interested in and bring that into the course as well. So that's going to be a lot of fun. I'm preparing that course now. And lastly, I just want to thank you. Thank you for your openness to hearing this talk and thinking maybe a little bit differently or maybe similarly as what you always thought. But I just want to thank the audience for joining me today on this little journey. So thank you. And I'll take questions now, so I'll stop sharing my screen and then I can at least, okay. All right, hey, that's great. Now I can just see myself. It's more fun to look at the slides. It's a bit weird to just look at myself. But anyway, it's my understanding that some of you would have got some questions out to Erin now. So I'm going to take a moment to read through some of these and then answer them for you. So I'm hoping to use GIS for my MRP to overlay environmental hazards in approximation to specific populations. Do you think this would be possible for someone in an MRP stream with no, oh, that's a great question. Lena, with no experience with GIS. This is, I plan to learn, but do I have the time? That's a fantastic question. And, it's intimidating, right? It's intimidating for people to think about, like, I see the value, but how do I bring this into my work? And again, I really want to impress upon you the importance of collaboration and for sharing expertise, right? So Meredith DeCock, for example, came into the program and she had some, working knowledge of GIS, but absolutely made great use of the resources we have at Brock. So we have not only people that are experienced with GIS, but also in the library, we have access to Esri Canada's virtual lab where you get free online tutorials to work through data sets. There are forums available online. There's myself, there's others at Brock across campus that use geospatial technologies. Kevin Turner is doing a talk. He's a member of the ESRC. He's doing a talk next week, I believe, on the 9th of February, where you can learn more about how he's used the technology. So yes, I believe absolutely you want to think carefully about, how you plan to use it. And I'm happy to have that conversation with you, but that is definitely a possibility. And I look forward to chatting more about that. But it's important to note, and I want to make the note again that because people use the word tool, one, people think, oh, well, these are just kind of tools that anybody can use. And that can be really dangerous because then people decide, oh, I can just produce this map without a scale, without a legend, all of these other pieces. And inevitably, they can end up actually misusing the tool and communicating things that aren't actually true, or and also understanding data too is really important. Okay. Next is a question from Allison mentioning, thank you, that it's neat. Yes, it's pretty cool that we can track biodiversity. At least it's one way, right? Again, there are some challenges around that, but it's another piece of information that we didn't already have. Would you be able to elaborate on the measures that are done to obtain biological heterogeneity composition of a site? Yes, absolutely. So we typically have to use hyperspectral remote sensing data. You saw a hyperspectral image when I showed you that last example. Those were compact airborne spectrographic imager data. And hyperspectral data means that you're looking at many parts of the electromagnetic spectrum very finely. So it's like really detailed information, so detailed that you can actually map those species of vegetation. And then you can actually see where these different species are, right? And again, you can apply these spatial statistics to looking at, is there sort of clustering of species, dispersion, etc. But that's also how we can kind of pluck out the Phragmites from a landscape, like a wetland ecosystem. So most definitely you can, and I'm happy to speak to you more about that one. Savannah, you guys are just it's so lovely to read your comments. You say it's such a nice thing before, so this was such an inspiring presentation. Thank you, I love that. I did not know there are so many applications of the technology. I know, it's incredible. You wouldn't imagine that, studying coral reefs and bleaching of coral as an example. I'm thinking of Jessica Blythe here, channeling, I know she's passionate about coral reef environments, and I get excited when she talks about them because I think about, studies that have been done using these technologies, right at the site in some case, and then above a site. And again, I know that you have to be really careful because you don't want to be traipsing through a coral reef environment and damaging the coral to get at observing it with these technologies. So what has been the biggest perspective shift that you have seen in the field? That's a good question. Perspective shift. Very interesting. The one thing I think I would note is that over the 30 years, I've noticed that I think overall people have started to really appreciate that these technologies can really contribute to solving the challenges we face rather than being a burden. And I say that because I remember early days being horrified when I was, just a kind of new, still in my undergrad, listening to a defense where someone said, really, these technologies are just a solution looking for a problem. And I was, oh my goodness, right? But the reality is some people have probably misused them and allowed for that kind of thinking to happen, right? And that's entirely appropriate. So now I see that people are embracing the technologies a little bit more. So that's one thing I've noticed that I think is really helpful. I hope that helps answer your question. If not, we can chat more about it. Okay, thank you for a great. I was wondering if you have any suggestions or resources students could refer to trying to learn. Absolutely, remote sensing techniques. I'm currently searching for helpful tutorials, so I'll share the slides so that you can actually click on those links. But one of them is to the Canada Centre for Mapping and Earth Observation. It used to be called the Canada Centre for Remote Sensing, and there are some excellent tutorials there. I've also actually shared, not that these are necessarily excellent, but I've shared lab assignments with students where I walk you through how to use the technology and the software. So at Brock, for example, I'll give you kind of step-by-step instructions on how to work through, and that's been helpful. So a few students in the program have used those, how do I use a GPS, right? So go through the basics, using software that you have available to you at Brock. So that's I think been helpful. So yes, I have many different resources. NASA's got some great resources too. Um, oh, thank you, Ryan. Um, from my experiences working, yes, in transdisciplinary teams, oh, that's beautiful. What's the most misunderstood aspect about geospatial technologies? Um, I think there's a couple things. One, people think GIS is geospatial technologies, that they're synonymous, they're one of the same, and they're not at all. And I don't want to pick on GIS, but GIS is one example of the technology. Remote sensing, global positioning systems, those are others. So when people just say, GIS expertise, it troubles me a little bit because it's like, well, you're excluding a bunch of other technologies. Just like I am, like I'm not talking a lot about augmented reality and virtual reality, and information systems are kind of the backdrop to some of those technologies too. But I found that to be a little bit tricky. You're reminding me of another point too, though, is I think to be, for those of us who know about geospatial technologies, it's our job to also find ways to better explain the technology, right? And to I think really appreciate that it's hard for me to know a lot about the technology and then to learn about the thing I'm studying. So wetlands, agricultural environments, and you need to be, I think, really humble, and collaborate with the experts, right? Darby McGrath, for example, she was lovely and explained to me, okay, the urban tree canopy is great, but Marilyne, you have to think about the soil, right? And I took soil science in undergrad, but for a moment I thought about, like, that's a massive, important piece to this challenge, right? So sometimes people misunderstand those of us who kind of embrace these technologies and see the value of using them to understand these environmental sustainability challenges. And some of us thinking about geospatial technologies sometimes forget to think about the application that we're looking at, and is it really relevant, right, that we use the technology. And there's a time and a place for the technology. Some people say the phrase, not everything that counts should be counted or can be counted, right? Thank you, Jess, by the way, for your nice comment. That it was a great talk. I appreciate that. All right, okay, let me get to, there's a lot still here. Okay, I wonder if the use, okay, I'm going to take a question from Cameron, and then I think maybe we'll get close to wrapping up there. But Cameron saying, thank you for an informative talk. Thank you, Cameron. Joining us from Azerbaijan. So it's getting late for you, Cameron, or later, but I wonder if the use of geospatial technologies is possible in social sciences, for example, economics. Oh, yes. Yeah, so really interesting. At times, as I mentioned, right, we can kind of maybe use the technology or think that it can be used when it's not appropriate to the particular problem, right? But thinking about maybe tourism and the movement of people, I know your interests are in tourism and the numbers of people moving through an area. We can use those technologies. We can think about, the use of water in an agricultural context, for example, in irrigation, and how, the cost savings of thinking about precision agriculture, which uses these technologies, or viticulture. And actually, there are many, even local farmers who make use of these technologies. I've been impressed with that, but also to think about their use of water, right? It can be very expensive to apply uniformly, water across viticulture context or even in agriculture. I'd need to know more specifically what you're referencing here, but I have seen it used in a few different ways that could fall under sort of economics. Okay. Let's see, one other question. Oh, okay, it was more of a comment from Shannon. And then another question about biodiversity and species richness. Yeah, so Baharak is asking about, I think the spectral characteristics, which I think I already got to with the hyperspectral data. Okay, and then last question here is from Jillian. In terms of GIS, I know there are multiple programming stuff. Yes, there are many different types of programming software that can be used. Have I seen a trend on what the preference is for Python versus R? That's a great question. Yeah, there have been, first I'll plug that there have been a lot of tutorials at Brock on how to use RStudio and how to use Python. Again, some of these commercially available software packages can be really expensive, and some people are turning to use those open source GIS and other programming software types because otherwise the cost is prohibitive, right? So I have definitely seen the curve kind of goes like this for the use of R as one example, Jillian. So if I think it's a good idea to learn R, I would say yes, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, and thank you very much. That's great to hear from Zach Harmer as well, former student of ours. So hopefully today I've answered your questions. It's been a little bit weird to be solo here. I hope you're still out there. I don't want to take any more of your time because I know it can be a lot to stay on a screen for more than an hour. So I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about geospatial technologies, their use and understanding, or at least helping to provide some information that hopefully brings us to some real solutions around the environmental sustainability challenges that we face. And it's been a lot of fun for me to talk about something I'm really passionate about. So I just thank you very much for your attention and for your questions. Okay, so thank you. Have a great day. And for students in the class, I'll be in touch with you very soon. All right, so long. Thanks.